Hello everybody. In this screencast we're going to look at something called view binding, which is something relatively new in Android, but it makes life a little bit easier. Basically we tend to use find view by ID a lot, and then we also have to cast or store the a reference to the layout component that we would like to manipulate, and things get a little bit hairy when you have a big layout and so on. So the view binding is a mechanism that where the Android Studio will automatically build a class that represents the view. You see like for example, this XML file, any of the components that has an ID will be included as an attribute of that component, and that component is called the binding. Okay, we'll look at it in a little bit. So to enable binding, you need to go in your application build Gradle, and then make sure that you have in one of the build features is to include view binding. So basically you go here, you type build build features, and here we are, and then part of the build features is view binding to true. If you set view binding to true, then notice what is going to happen. Now when we sync, now notice I have these layout files. I have activity, I have an activity. Let's say this is the first activity. This is the layout file for the first activity. Now you see the name is activity underscore first. So basically what is going to happen is that a class that will be created called first. All right, let's see, binding. Here it is, activity first binding. Okay, so that represents activity first binding. It's a binding. I'll call it binding. Now what I want to use is, instead of me setting the content view like this, I'd like to get a reference to that binder. So to get the reference to the binding, we'll say binding equals activity first binding dot inflate, and then get layout inflator. So basically that's basically how you will inflate the binding. So basically this will get, this class represents the XML file. You see here a binding to that XML file. When you inflate that binding, meaning you are inflating the XML file. Now you have the binding, and basically set content view. I'm not going to use r.id anymore, but I'm going to say binding dot get root, and get root is the topmost element or the parent element of the view. Here it is. That's how you set your content view. Now, if you look at that layout, if you look at this layout, there is a button here, right? The button, its ID is button go to second, right? So basically, to do that, all you have to do, to reference that button, all you have to do, I'm not going to use find view by ID. I'm going to say binding dot button go to second. You see here, there is a variable that represents the button, and you see that the type is automatically detected because it is, the layout was inflated through the binding. So the binding is a class that's created by Android, by the build tools for Android. And that class represents that layout. So basically here you see that I can get the button, and then I could do set on click listener, new on click list. So basically here we go. Now if there is, let's say, let's add another. So there is this first activity. This is called text view label. So if I go here, you'll see that let's say when you click on the button, I want to clear or maybe let it say hello, for example. I could say binding dot, see here, text label dot set text to say hello, right? So now when I run this, you will see that it will the app will run, and let's see, it's building, and you see here it says first activity. When I click the button, it says hello. Click the button again, it's going to say hello. So yeah, you could see that the binding saves you the effort of creating variables that's going to hold this text view label, or the edit text, or a text view, or a button, and so on. So basically it's all inside the binding. It's like the holder pattern that you're going to learn about when we look at list views or lists. So that's how we do it for activities. Now what about how we do this for fragments? So it's straightforward also. Let's go to the next. I'll create an intent to go to the second intent. New. Let me go to the second activity. So I have another activity that's going to have a fragment, and then I'll show you how to do this inside the fragment. So let's say we go start activity, new intent, and this is the first activity dot this. I'll go to the second activity dot class. So I'm just going to go to the second activity. When you click the button, it will go to the second activity. Now let's have a look at the second activity. I'll remove all of that stuff, and the second activity will have inside it, let's have a root view. Let's say this is the root or the content view. All right, and then what's going to happen is that I'm just going to insert inside it the first fragment. So here's the first fragment, and inside the first fragment, or the second fragment, we call it the second fragment. No, this is the first activity, and then we have the second activity. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to get support fragment manager dot begin transaction dot set dot add fragment new second fragment comma new second fragment. Oh no, it needs the reference first, so r.id dot the content view new second fragment, and then commit, right? All right, cool. So basically all I'm doing just adding it to the layout. So basically when you come in, I'm just going to add it to the layout. This is the fragment, right? Now inside the fragment, you could see here we are also inflating. So basically the same story, but instead of the binding starting with activity, the binder now, because this is a layout, see here, this is a layout called fragment underscore second. So basically that's the layout, fragment underscore second. Now let's add some interesting things in that layout. Let's say we change this to convert it to a constraint layout. Here it is. And let's add maybe a button, for example. Let's add a button. Let's add some edit text. And edit text, here it is. Let's say here we go. And let's add this button to go all the way up here. Just so that we could show you this. Let's see. And basically the edit text will go, let's say, under the button, just to show you that we are able to do this. And similarly, let's say we get a switch, for example, and put it under the edit text. Okay, and let's give it a little bit of margins. Okay. All right, so let's say the button, we'll call it, say, button, let's say submit, for example. And let's say we go here and give this a name, edit text, say person name. Okay, cool. So here it is. And then the switch, let's say switch allow, for example, or something like that. Okay, so here we are. So we created all of these. Now, in the old way of doing things, we used to get the view. We used to come here and say view equals this, and then we return the view. Right, and then we use the view to find, we say view dot find view by id, r.id dot button, for example, submit, and that's how you get reference to the button or the edit text person name or the switch that we just created, right? Now the easy way is using the binding. So basically binding will start with a fragment. So it's called, because the name of the file is what? Fragment second. You see, the name of the file is fragment second. So the binding will say fragment second binding. See here, binding. That's the fragment second binding. So now to get an instance of this, very straightforward also. We'll do it the same way. Here it is. Fragments binding equals fragment second binding dot inflate. And you see here there is an inflate that has 3 parameters, 1, 2, 3. Similar to this inflate. You see this inflate has 1, 2, 3. But this inflator has inflate. The first thing is an inflator. Okay, inflator. Second one is the container, and then false. Don't attach it to the container. Here it is. You give it the binder, right? Now we want to return a view. To return the view, you say binding dot get root, which is the root element of the view. So that's how you do this. Now, when you're using binding, you could say on create view and then on view created. You see here on view created, which happens after the on create view. So now you have the binding. Let's say you want the button. You say dot. Here it is, the button. You see button submit dot set on click listener new on click listener. Now if you want, for example, when you click on the button to retrieve whatever the user has typed, for example, let's say if we go back to the fragment, let's say whatever the user has typed, I want, for example, to make it the text of the button, for example. Let's do that. So basically when the user clicks, I'll go retrieve the string for, let's say, a string, which is the whatever the user has typed, whatever they typed, equals, for example, binding dot, and it's the edit text dot get text to string, right? You see here, I don't have to do any find view by IDs anymore. Now, if I, this is whatever they typed, and then I could change the button text. So I'll do binding dot button submit dot set text to typed. So whatever you type, it's going to change. Then whatever you type is going to show up as the text for the button. So let's run it again. I go back again here. All right. Here we go. We go to the second activity. We are here. Now I need to type something here. Let's say test. And I click on the button. You see here it says test. Testing. Here we go. And testing. Hello. And you click here and you see. So basically you could see that I am able to use the binding it's very straightforward. You just go into your upgrade, the build Gradle, make sure that build features and binding is true, right? Is set to true. Then the name of the binding class that gets created. So for example, it's based on the name of the XML file. The names of the names of the variables that show up here are the IDs of the components. Like for example, if we go into the second fragment and the button, I change its name to submit, say for example, submitting, for example, or something like that. Submitting button. Here it is, and I refactor. Now if we go to the second fragment, it's not happy because there is nothing called button submit. So there is now button submitting, right? And similarly here, button submitting. Cool. So you could see that this makes life easier. It's much easier to manage, less mistakes, because you are going to misuse the IDs, and these IDs now, whenever you assign them, just be a little bit careful what names you give, because these are going to be the names of parameters or of variables that are created in the binding. So you need to understand what they are, right? So basically here it is, button submit, and similarly here is button submit. All right, so you could see here that the binding makes life easier. You know, all you have to pay attention is how to inflate. So basically this is how we inflate when you are using fragments. And then basically this is how we inflate and set content view when we are using activities. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.